All right. Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Texas Rail Advocates, for having us. Thank you all for coming here. I know that there are more interesting things to do on a Thursday night than listen to congressional briefing, but I will try to include all the energy that we are experiencing in DC, because I know for a fact, having just had our meeting earlier this week, that there has never been more energy behind passenger rail at the federal level, and I think there's tremendous opportunities. And frankly, the national program depends on states like Texas becoming full partners in the program, because it's just not going to work unless it's national, unless it's bipartisan. And Texas is a leader in so many parts of the U.S. Transportation world, the technology world, and so we're all really looking to the folks in this room to kind of lead the way at the Texas level. Here we go. I'm going to start with funding, because that is really kind of the big delta between the pre-bipartisan infrastructure law world and the world we're in now. So Congress just passed the fiscal year 2022 budget bill. It was just over 5 months late, not quite half a year, which is disappointing but not surprising. Already we're in a bit of a scrambled calendar. There is some good news. I mean, the obvious good news is just look at the graph. You can see the tremendous increase in funding for transportation at the federal level. That kind of underplays what's going on in the rail picture specifically. That's all transportation. If you look at what's going on in rail specifically, it's a 485% increase between FY21, FY22, and tremendous opportunities again, tremendous challenges. We're not used to spending this much money. The appropriators did in fact come up with $504 million in additional funding, in addition to the kind of guaranteed funds that were identified by the bipartisan infrastructure law. It's a good sign. That is good news. That includes an additional $330 million for Amtrak operations. The bad news is that's $4 billion less than was authorized by the bipartisan infrastructure law. I'm going to get into that difference in future slides, but it already shows that there's a little bit of a slide back, a little bit of a retreat from the ambition of the bipartisan infrastructure law, and it shows that there's a lot of room for us as advocates, as rail industry representatives, to kind of inject some steel in the spine of congressional appropriators and transportation leaders. Another big thing that came out of the FY22 budget that was just passed 2 weeks ago, congressionally directed funding requests. This is what is formerly known as earmarks. They are back. It is a big opportunity to jumpstart, to accelerate the corridor development in your region, in your state. I identified some of the big intercity rail and regional rail projects that were funded as part of the FY22 earmarks. Most of it went to highways, most of it went to airports, but there were some key projects. So I want to point out. One is the $8 million to Georgia DOT. It was sponsored by Senator Ossoff, and it's the Atlanta to Savannah passenger rail corridor. It does the environmental impact statement. It pays for the design, environmental work, and it's going to be extremely helpful because it means you don't have to go through the grant application process. We've also seen something for the Maryland Transit Administration for Baltimore Penn Station upgrades, and a $10 million to Sandag for a coaster commuter rail stabilization project. So these are the kind of projects that really are going to compete well in the earmark process. As we look ahead to FY23, I encourage any advocates out there, any local elected officials, to start looking at your rail plan and start thinking, what are some discrete elements of corridor development that are already defined in the state rail plan that I can go to my member of Congress and request for them to become the project sponsor for. Because again, it just really shortcuts the development process when you don't have to wait for the notice of funding opportunity to develop grant applications, wait for the FRA to consider it, or the FTA to consider it among a couple hundred other projects, and then eventually obligate it year, 18 months later. There are some restrictions we are seeing on the House side with FY23. It's still very fluid. What I'm hearing is they're going to focus on highways, transit, and airports. Intercity passenger rail does not seem to be explicitly part of the earmarked picture. However, there are some workarounds there. I know of some congressional districts of some rail authorities where they've identified a rail project that also has a bus transit element to it, of a larger station upgrade. And they were able to get around those restrictions. Senate's still very fluid. Again, we saw with Senator Ossoff and the Atlanta-Savannah corridor, intercity passenger rail still seems to be very much part of the picture. So I encourage everyone to go, again, look at the state rail plan. We heard from committee folks who are asking what we're hearing from states. They've gone directly and tried to get states to apply for these earmark funds, and they're saying we're not hearing as much positive feedback as we want to. I mean, obviously you're gonna hear from California, Illinois, the Northeast corridor. They're already geared towards these kinds of passenger rail development CapEx programs. Again, as Peter mentioned, we need to find those local funding matches to unlock that for the rest of the country. So like I mentioned, the FY23 calendar's already scrambled. It means we have less time to do the budgeting work that needs to happen. President Biden just dropped his budget on Monday. We're still kind of processing that. It's 2 months late. Well, moving on. House Appropriations, we're going to hear more from them in late April, and see whether they take the lead of President Biden or whether they kind of go their own way. That is the thing about presidential budget requests is you can ignore them, you can use them as a jumping off point, you can use them as a doorstop. And more often than not, they use it as doorstops, but it's an interesting opening gambit within the Democratic leadership, which right now has the trifecta. Another big thing, I'm gonna just jump down to the bottom of the slide here. Midterms are coming. There's gonna be a wave of retirements, mostly on the Democratic side of the ledger. I think they understand that the fundamentals are against them. I think they understand that you generally get wave elections after the White House changes hands, and you get that kind of the pendulum swings back. And there's a lot of older chairmen right now in the Democratic caucus who don't really want to take that demotion down to ranking member. Another one is redistricting, which is very important for us because we're very focused in on which members of Congress have Amtrak stations, have transit stations in their district. And we're going to get a little scrambling of that. So all things to work out, but it also means less time in DC, more time fundraising, more time campaigning, less time to think about the actual business of passing a fiscal year 23 budget in a meaningful time frame. It might mean less transparency in a lot of their decision-making process and more of the Senate and the House leadership kind of working together in smoky back rooms and deciding what can we do so we don't have a government shutdown right in advance of the midterms, which I don't think anyone wants. Maybe Republicans a little bit more because it does falls more on the responsibility of the Democrats. And of course, some key upcoming DOT deadlines. We're going to see the establishment of the corridor identification and development program. That's going to establish the pipeline of projects. I think one of the big things with all this new funding for passenger rail, for short lines, well, specifically for passenger rail, I think the short lines have a good capital plan in the back of their mind. But passenger rail, we don't really know where this money is going to go. It's all kind of in these separate baskets at state DOTs with various levels of transparency. What the FRA wants to do is allow a process for states to submit those plans, standardize them, create a national repository where anyone can go look and see where is the corridor in my state, how is it ranked, how is it prioritized in terms of where it is on future funding lists. So May 16th, they're gonna kind of, it's a starting gun. They're crafting the program right now, but May 16th is kind of the start of the race to submit your projects, submit your corridors to that program. We'll also see an update from the US DOT on Amtrak's direct grants, which I'll talk more a little bit later. There are some potential red flags that we are facing in this budget cycle. There are a lot of inflationary pressures on government spending right now. Transportation, the way it is structured in the appropriations process at the federal level, it's paired with housing. So transportation, housing, urban development, we call it THUD. Rising housing prices are going to eat up a lot of whatever increases we get for that account, the 302B allocation. So you can already see what happened in FY22. Of the $6.5 billion increase to that account, almost $5 billion went to the housing side of the margin. Only $1.5 billion went to DOT. I expect that trend to continue. So any kind of increases we want to see for CRISI, for Fed State, which is going to be much more passenger oriented, we're going to have to fight tooth and nail with the housing side, because when that program is underfunded, people get evicted, and it's ugly. Another one is we're already starting to see the first signs of a backlash to the increase in rail funding as part of the bipartisan infrastructure law. Not a lot, but there's a small cadre of House Republicans who introduced a bill last week called the Returning Amtrak to Economic Sustainability Act, or RATES Act. It just kind of redefines the Amtrak mission away from providing high-quality service to ensuring route profitability. That's something we just actually successfully redefined in the last reauthorization cycle, which just completed in November as part of the bipartisan infrastructure bill, where we really said it's not about whether Amtrak makes money, it's about who Amtrak makes money for, and it's the communities that are served. It's the small communities. It's the Interstate 20 corridor, where we really want to connect all the small communities between Dallas and between Atlanta and get them on network. So we're seeing a little bit of a pushback. It was not an overly aggressive bill, but it was introduced by Representative Rick Crawford, a Republican out of Arkansas, and he is the ranking member of T&I Rail Subcommittee. And in January 2023, he could be the chair of the T&I Rail Subcommittee. So I put his full quote here, just because I thought it was an important window into their thinking. And he said, Representative Crawford said, if the federal government is advocating billions of dollars to a company that disproportionately serves coastal, metropolitan populations over rural America, at the very least, we should require Amtrak to attempt to be economically sustainable. Again, it's going to be states like Texas, states like Montana with the Empire Builder, Midwestern states, flyover states that right now really do rely on Amtrak and deserve to have more service, frankly, deserve to have better quality service, that are going to be a linchpin to making sure that the rail programs introduced and created by the bipartisan infrastructure bill are successful. Because, again, it's over the life of this bill, we're going to see Congress change a few times, but again, the winds are at the Republicans' back, and we really need Republican states to come on board. So turning to kind of I want to dive deep into some of the key programs. You can see here There's a 5-year funding picture, a lot of new programs, a lot of columns, a lot of rows. I don't want to get lost in the spreadsheet because I don't think it ends up telling you that much about what it is we're really trying to do here. But I did want to point out, first of all, a lot of money. And second of all, there is an interesting kind of structural tweak that was introduced with the bipartisan infrastructure law, the IIJA, that I've never seen before, I don't think has been tried before, and it's kind of what makes, it's the secret sauce to why everyone's so excited about this bill. Under the blue heading, that is the authorized amount. That's standard reauthorization, multi-year funding bill. It's the best I've ever heard it explained. It's like a hunting license where you can go out every year and say, go to members of Congress and say, this is what the kind of the unsigned check that you wrote, we would like you to fulfill this promissory note. Generally speaking, they will give you 70 cents on the dollar, sometimes much less. And so there's always this big gap between the authorizer's vision and then the appropriators who really had their eyes on the purse of government, what they feel like they can get away with giving you. Which is why one of the big innovations of the bipartisan infrastructure law was, and then the pink heading, which was advance appropriations, where they said it doesn't matter how big we go with authorizing if we're not actually requiring ourselves to live up to that future promise. So what we're going to do is use advance appropriations, which is used in some military accounts to provide a little bit of funding stability across future years. And we're going to go full 5 years, guaranteed funding across hundreds of programs, many of which are new. And for passenger rail, you can just see it right here. It's 60, everything under this pink heading at the bottom, that's all guaranteed funding. That's $66 billion. That's not even every important rail adjacent program. There's also RAISE grants, but I just really wanted to focus in here on rail specific. And so that provides a really important sense of certainty about these programs. I think the general hope of legislators when they constructed this is it's going to get some of the states who haven't traditionally been active in passenger rail development off the sidelines because they know there's so much funding coming, there's a lot of certainty behind it, and if we spend a few million in development of the capacity to administer these programs, we're going to get a return on that investment in leveraging local funding dollars through these federal grants. The other thing I want to point out is there's $33 billion in authorized accounts, which means we can't be, our view, Rail Passengers Association's view is we cannot be complacent. We cannot be satisfied with the $66 billion. A full third of the funding is locked up in the year-to-year battle to try to see appropriators realize the promissory note that was laid out by authorizers. And when you consider the capital needs of the Northeast Corridor, of Illinois, of the West Coast rail corridors, where they already have DOTs that are very engaged in this, that $33 billion could be the difference between kind of improving the status quo and really transforming the U.S. rail network. So we're going to be very engaged over the next 4 years over making sure appropriators unleash that full third of the bipartisan infrastructure law. I grayed out Northeast Corridor, but because we're not in the Northeast Corridor, we're in Texas, and so you guys are going to focus on the national network funding. Amtrak direct grants. Congress decided we're going to really address the state of good repair, but we're going to do it in a way that provides a little bit of accountability. And so they put all these dedicated, guaranteed funds, $3.2 billion for FY23 for the national network, with another $2 billion authorized. And they put all those dedicated funds, which are restricted to CapEx, which is upgrading stations, equipment refurbishment, equipment procurement, upgrades to signaling and communications, and they said we're going to have the US DOT decide where that money goes in conversation with Amtrak. So that was the May 16th deadline I kind of outlined. It's worth thinking about because, Amtrak normally gets $2 billion in total, and about 1.2 billion of that is for the national network, and a lot of it's for operations. And they're going to go from 1.2 to 5.4 billion. That's going to be a big challenge for anyone. And Amtrak has not been in an expansionary frame of mind for a very long time. They're trying to get there. Good on them. Amtrak Connects Us was a beautiful vision, but there's a difference between drawing maps and actually putting that money into projects. Another thing I wanted to, and we're going to hear from Ray Lang tomorrow, and he's a very smart guy, and I'm hoping to hear some really good updates on how they are going to try to expand the capacity internally to move all that money. Another thing I want to point out is that authorized funding, that $2 billion for the national network, another $1.1 billion for the Northeast Corridor, that's all their operating funds. So even if you're complacent with some of these other federal grants, we really need appropriators to come through on the operating funds, because that's the thing that keeps the trains running. That's what allows them to build up the HR department internally, to hire new engineers, to hire new administrators. It's their marketing budget, and just generally keeps the trains running. Fed-state partnership, this is the big one. This is the one that it's a new program. It's a complete overhaul of a federal-state partnership, good repair program that existed previously. They kind of carved that out, gutted it, and ended up deciding if any possible passenger rail corridor development activity that we can think of, let's put it in here. And they put the most money. And you can see 7.2 dedicated, 7.2 billion guaranteed for FY23, with another potential 1.5 billion on top of that if appropriators come through. They did something interesting, which is they wanted a little regional parity, or a little regional balance. Obviously, the Northeast Corridor has 100 billion plus in identified needs for development. So they said the Northeast Corridor, which again I grayed out, they said minimum of 45% goes to NEC, minimum of 45% goes to non-NEC projects, and then so you have that 10%, which multi-purpose. It can be flexed across either one, depending on what the quality of applications that the FRA receives. And that includes, by the way, private operators. It doesn't even have to be Amtrak as operator. So it's going to be really interesting to see how that breaks out in the first round of funding availability. I think it's going to be challenging for people to gear up. Again, as Peter mentioned, there's a 20% minimum local match requirements. If you look at how they broke it out over CRISI, which is the previous main vehicle for passenger rail development, they were really, they liked those programs. They liked those applications where it was closer to 50%. But it's a different dollar amount. It's a different dollar figure, and we haven't been through this before, so it's going to be interesting to see how this develops. Finally, and again, this is not an exhaustive list. There's RAISE, there's MEGA, which are projects of national significance. RAISE is very multimodal. It all could theoretically benefit freight rail, passenger rail. But I did want to just limited time focus on these three, which is CRISI. Short line freight railroads have traditionally benefited from this program. The big change here is it went from being the centerpiece, where you had so many. It was so oversubscribed that a lot of good projects are being left behind, to now you have at least a floor of $1 billion, potential for $2 billion, and it's going to be, I think, a lot more oxygen in the room with this application round. Railroad crossing elimination grants, again, that's self-explanatory. It's a new program. I don't know how the FRA is going to oversee this, administer it, but we're obviously interested. Again, I would think freight rail would be very competitive in this compared to the passenger side of the ledger, given where we are at with a lot of state DOTs. And finally, restoration and enhancement grants. That's $50 million. That's a small dollar account, but one of the interesting things it does is it provides operating assistance across a 6-year period on a step-down basis, which means, every time you launch a new passenger rail corridor, you have that kind of the startup costs, the startup growing pains, where you're trying to get ridership up, you're trying to get operations smoothed out, frequencies where you want it to be. And if you plan a passenger rail corridor with the right levels of service, serving the right markets, I think you can use that 6-year path to sustainability to get to a point where you really have minimal public contributions to the annual operating subsidy. And so it's really important that Congress authorizes that at the full amount. So as I mentioned, the president's budget, you can just see here, I highlighted with red between the authorized and the budget request. Every red square is something where the president kind of backed off what he had just signed into law in November. So he took Chrissy, cut it in half. He took federal-state partnership for intercity passenger rail, cut it in a third, from $1.5 billion to $500 million. Railroad crossing elimination grants in half. Amtrak National Network, $400 million haircut. So it's disappointing to see kind of this step back already. Again, inflationary pressures. It's a big spending bill. There's a lot of increases in other categories, but you do kind of wonder whether the Democrats are just doing that Democratic thing where they're afraid of using power. And again, it's just another work item for us, where we really got to go to appropriators and say, ignore the president's budget. You just passed this law. Why don't we move forward? Because the energy is there. We got some policy requests. You can include policy riders as part of any budget bill. One of the things we really want to do is focus on getting Amtrak back up to pre-pandemic levels on state-supported services and on long-distance routes and on the Northeast Corridor. We are not at pre-pandemic levels. I think it's a bad look to give Amtrak this much money and still have them running fewer trains than they were before COVID was introduced. There are obviously exogenous realities that they are confronted with in terms of a tight labor market, in terms of having to get everyone cleared and licensed in a safe fashion. And so we understand the constraints they are working with, but we also want Congress to press Amtrak to provide a clear timeline, because they were going to come back on March 28th. They decided they couldn't meet that deadline, and now they are saying, some point, we'll let you know. And we would rather them have a deadline and miss it than just kind of just be like, well, you'll see it when it's on the tracks. National fleet renewal, again, that's kind of our basic point is, if you fully authorize all those cool new rail programs you created, plus the Amtrak direct grants, it's really going to accelerate a lot of the renewal work that needs to be done, the procurement work that needs to be done, the Rail Supply the rail supply chain is obviously probably not at the point where it needs to be right now to accept all these funds, but I think it's better to go big early and let everyone know that there's going to be this level of commitment going forward, so that we can kind of retool. Finally, speed project delivery. I'm not going to get into that in detail here because a lot of it focuses on the Northeast Corridor projects, but there's a tremendous desire, I think, to show some near-term wins, to show shovels in the ground, and not let this get caught into a extended, lengthy review process where the first, awards we're seeing are in 18 months. And so one of the things we can do is look at the existing blueprints, such as state rail plans, such as the Northeast Corridor inventory, which was done by the Northeast Corridor Commission, and don't wait until the statutorily mandated deadline, but get that money out the door for this construction season. Big point of effort for us is the Amtrak board. Right now, Amtrak has 2 vacant seats, 6 expired seats where the director inhabiting that position is just serving on a rollover basis. I believe the longest rollover tenure we have is Jeffrey Moreland, whose term expired in 2015. This is something that the Biden administration could easily address and improve Amtrak's geographic balance. One of the things we successfully got inserted into the bipartisan infrastructure bill was a requirement that Amtrak's board of directors has to have geographic balance and business line balance. So 2 from the Northeast Corridor, 2 from the state-supported services, and 2 from long-distance services. It also has a partisan element to it where you can see kind of R's and D's next to all those names. So there's Democratic seats and Republican seats. A lot of this is driven by the Senate. I think we've seen Senator Duckworth from Illinois talk about the need for disabled voices on the Amtrak board, so I expect something to come through that. I know labor is pushing theirs, but if you have any good Republican Amtrak mayors, now's the time to get behind them. I know we've been pushing for Knox Ross to be on the board, and he would be a great voice for the national network and passengers. And it's something, again, that the Biden administration can do relatively easy. So I'm going to kind of finish in the final third of the presentation here, but we had this joke in DC where Infrastructure Week was Groundhog's Day, where anytime the president got in trouble or kind of entered a lull in their communications plan, they would just slap out some stuff about the need to address the infrastructure crisis. They'd looked at the American Society of Civil Engineers report card and say, it's Infrastructure Week in America, and we're going to finally address this thing. Nothing would happen, and then 6 weeks later, we'd repeat the cycle. And so when the bipartisan infrastructure law came up, I just assumed it was going to be the same way, and I assumed it would just all collapse in rubble and smoke. And then the damn thing got passed, and we got to figure out. We found ourselves, we've been chasing this whale for so long, and all of a sudden we got it, and we're like, okay, what's next? And so we are working to maintain momentum in 2022 and beyond. And I know Texas Rail Advocates and Peter are there doing the same thing right now. It's probably, I think this is the biggest this meeting has ever been. And it's going to be a challenge, but it's an opportunity. So one of the things we're doing is we continue to try to grow our influence. We are, I'd like to think, true policy partners with key committees, key staffers. We helped write the bill, and they're looking to us to help implement it. We've worked with the Biden transition team when they've asked for our input on the Amtrak Board of Directors, on the first 100-day initiatives. Right now, there's the Surface Transportation Board. Many of you are probably aware of that's working its way through the House, and we have input on that, as well as potential nominees for DOT political appointments. We've worked directly with the DOT on requests for information on how they want to structure some of these programs to better engage with stakeholders, with passengers, and with towns served by the national network, but also towns that are not served by the national network and that want to be, as well as a number of advisory councils. National Tourism Advisory Council is one of them. State DOTs, that's a big one. I mean, we work with SAPRC, as well as a number of individual states, regional state organizations. The need to find those local funding matches is a big one, as well as, you know, that Section 209 relationship with Amtrak, where they got to figure out, you know, how do we structure these payments? How do we structure all the cost sharing methodologies and the cost allocations? We do a number of economic projections for new services. We developed an in-plan economic benefits model with economists from the University of Southern Mississippi Trent Lott Center for Transportation, and we want to show not just the cost, but you know, what are the economic benefits to bringing passenger rail service to new communities. Work with Amtrak, obviously. You know, we like to think we are the voice of the passenger, and there's been a hell of a lot of changes on board, and our members let them know it. But we have a open but constructive relationship, and of course there's a lot of work that needs to be done for their Amtrak Connects US vision. And of course the Surface Transportation Board, which has a big role to play in terms of how you mediate between host railroads and passenger railroads. You know, we worked on this Gulf Coast issue. We've been working on the passenger dedicated working force internally, and we just had Chairman Oberman speak at our meeting, and he had some really interesting things to say. All of which is that, you know, I'm tooting our own horn here, but you know, victory has 1,000 fathers, defeat is an orphan. I know for groups like TRA, you probably have been. There's been moments where you felt like the lone voice in the wilderness, where you just like, I don't know if this is ever going to happen. I don't see how we get this boulder up the hill. But now we're there. There's a tremendous amount of funding. There's going to be a lot of paid lobbyists who are rushing onto the scene to try to, a lot of engineering firms. That's good. We need all those stakeholders to become involved, but it's important for advocates to really stand up for the interest of the passengers, for the interest of the communities that want to be connected by passenger rail, and help shape the implementation. So it's also important that successful organizations are able to harness this kind of energy to advance the mission and build up the institution. And so, you know, again, I think we see TRA doing this right now with this excellent meeting. And I think there's a lot of room for other state associations to kind of follow the Texas Rail Advocates' lead. Of course, we're always refining our message. We're ready to rebut the anti-rail arguments, a lot of which I'm sure are very familiar to you. Passenger rail only makes sense on the East Coast. We need to focus on traditional infrastructure like roads and bridges. High-speed rail doesn't work in America. Just look at California. But it's also, you know, especially that last one. There's some truth to that. But I can go on forever about you know, deficits and how many general fund transfers we had to the Highway Trust Fund since 2008. I think we're at like $250 billion in taxpayer dollars to prop that up, and no opportunity, no chance that we're going to raise the gas tax. But it's also important to make the positive case. I don't think you can let people who are against passenger rail dictate the terms of engagement, and so we really do try to show the popular support for it. We engaged with a pollster and asked them post the passage of the bipartisan infrastructure law, how they felt, how Americans felt, and 78% of them support passenger rail investment. That's a majority of both parties, so that's 95% of Democrats and 61% of Republicans. So this is bipartisan. 60% of those surveyed said they would support spending $100 billion. We're gonna go tell members of Congress, we do have support for you to go all the way on this bill. A third would have spent more than $66 billion guaranteed. 40% would have gone even higher. And then we also see 2/3 of those surveyed think there should be a national railroad plan. So this is not just the East Coast. This is coast to coast, including the middle. We also see 64% of Americans support the idea of using tax dollars, which I think is really an important data point, because it shows that there's going to be, if you can get those trains running, and that's, that can be a big if. We've got in the pay money for a study, put it on the shelf, wait 10 years, repeat cycle. We can't do that this time. But if you can get those trains running, there will be support for public investment in them. And only 27% think Amtrak should be expected to make a profit for the government. Again, we know trains make money. It's not for the government. It's for the communities that the trains serve. We also, we've come up with a number of one-pagers that address different kinds of economic benefits. You can find them at railpassengers.org/ledge.resources. They cover economic benefits, environmental benefits. We focused on high-speed rail, how the national network serves small town and rural communities, as well as OTP, on-time performance. This is an example of one. We try to keep these updated. We looked at, we've done a number of studies on individual lines, which we list here, the economic benefits on an annual basis. We also talk about how trains should be an effective part of any responsible national energy policy by providing a low-cost alternative to high gas taxes. So I encourage you to look those up. I won't go through line by line, but they are, I think, a useful resource if you're looking to talk about passenger rail to decision makers. And I'll close out there because I've gone on for a little bit. I don't know if we wanted questions, Peter, but I will be around this evening and all tomorrow. So if you have any questions for me, you can find me. And thank you again for your time and attention.